Hi, you're listening to Radio Naira on 101.9 FM. I'm your host, Abhisar Cherukuri, for our new show, Health Beyond Borders, a holistic and inclusive approach to health as we discuss different medical practices and medical treatments across the world with physicians and explore how to better take care of your health. With us today, I have Dr. Gopi Vasudevan, a gastroenterologist here in Nebraska. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, Dr. Vasudevan.
My pleasure. Thank you, Abhi.
Thank you. So for the listeners out here in the world who haven't got the pleasure to meet you yet, could you speak again to how you entered the medical field, again, what drew you to medicine and to being in gastroenterology?
Sure. I grew up in the U.S., been living here since 1970, and always had an interest in biology.
Mm-hmm.
And I was actually also interested in business. That's a long story as to how my taste eventually evolved, but I found that I did well in biology, and I found that I was very curious about how body works, how nature works. So started out with that interest. As far as going into medical school, it was a natural transit into a field that I thought had a lot of opportunities, a lot of variety of experiences. And through the long process of medical school residency, eventually came to some understanding about the importance of digestive health. It is not something that's given much attention to even nowadays, but it has a massive impact on people's health and lives. And that became very clear to me as a resident when we started looking at how many people were presenting with digestive problems. A gastroenterologist essentially deals with all of the digestive disease issues, starting from one end on the top where you eat, all the way to the other end, and all the organs that are involved in that process, including the liver, the pancreas, gallbladder, esophagus, stomach, small bowel, large bowel, etc. So all of those processes that are involved in digestion is essentially a part of our work flow.
Mm-hmm. And so being a gastroenterologist for the amount of time that you've had, what are the majority of the cases that you've seen so far? Again, I've noticed that in your past work or past videos, you've mentioned colorectal cancer or even Crohn's or IBS. So what is the patients that usually end up flowing into your clinic here in Kearney?
I would say by far and away more than 90% of what I help patients out with has to do with what I would call functional bowel disorder. It's otherwise known as IBS. I'm not a fan of the term IBS. I'm a fan of the term syndromes because essentially a syndrome is a term we in the medical professionals use to cover the fact that we fully don't understand something. And so we just call it a syndrome, which can have a variety of presentations, a variety of definitions, a variety of treatments. The IBS is a well-known, understood, from a lay public point of view, proper term that everybody uses, but I prefer to call it by its older term. And that's starting to become more common now amongst the professionals in my field to call it functional bowel disorder. And so most of that has to do with digestive disease issues, meaning disorders of digestion, disorders of bowel function, disorders of diet, etc., lifestyle choices. I would say that's more than 90% of what we see. The other things that other people talk about that receive a common press, such as colorectal cancer, Crohn's and disease, as well as ulcerative colitis, making up the inflammatory bowel disease spectrum, pancreatic cancer, which is on the rise, esophagitis, peptic ulcer disease. All of these things probably make up another 10, maybe 15%. So somewhere between 85 to 90%, I think, in my line of work has to do with disorders of digestion.
Gotcha. That makes perfect sense. And again, I think we've noticed a good trend of either IBS or acid reflux tends to, again, affect certain populations. And so I wanted to ask, is there certain lifestyle changes that you've noticed or, again, certain demographics that have been affected by IBS or things that you'd recommend overall for your patient population to, again, try to avoid IBS or any other inflammatory bowel syndromes?
So that's a deep dive into a long conversation.
Right. Two prongs.
real brief. By the medical texts, textbooks and the literature, they start trying to focus on identifying etiologies, that is, causative factors. And they have gravitated towards subpopulations, looking at Jewish origin for inflammatory bowel disease, for example, or people from other parts of the world that deal with IBS, et cetera, a functional bowel disorder. My experience has been, I've mostly been in the Midwest. I was raised in Kansas, got my degree in Kansas, got my fellowship training, and was on senior staff at Henry Ford Hospital in Michigan and Detroit, and lived at least for 20 plus years practicing in Oklahoma and now in Nebraska. All of those states would essentially be considered part of the proper Midwest in the United States. Having said that, I get the feeling from talking to others that it's not that much different on the East or West Coast, to be quite honest. And in general, I would say that as far as functional bowel disorders go, I do not focus on any subpopulation demographic characteristics. I purely focus on the patient, their story, what is their lifestyle, what is their diet. I focus a lot on diet. That's probably a little different than the average gastroenterologist. They'll give some superficial lip service to it. They'll ask you, they might tell you something like, oh, eat right, or eat a high fiber diet, or this diet might be contributing to it. I actually spend a great deal of my time digging down into the depths of what their dietary lifestyle is like and how that affects their daily living. So I personally do not. If the question is how do I focus, I personally do not focus on demographics. I talk to the patient. I treat each patient individually as separate. Each one has their own circumstances. We now have garnered a large amount of information that even understands, to some extent, the influence of genetics, but more important, the influence of epigenetics. That is the ability of your environment to alter your genetic expression, your phenotype. Doesn't change the genetic code, but it may change how certain genes are turned on at certain loci and certain genes are turned off. And the long-term implications of that may even persist for a couple or more generations. Really interesting stuff. So I focus much more on that. If I had to say in summary, what are the biggest things that involve gastroesophageal reflux disease, functional bowel disorder, et cetera, I would say they are first and foremost diet. Second, the impact of stress. Third, medications that unfortunately they either are taking over the counter that physicians don't know about, or physicians do know about, but pay very little attention to the consequences or side effects of those medicines. And in this day and age, you're often getting what I would call committee care. So more than one physician involved in your care. People are very busy. Physicians are very busy. They're asked to do more with less resources at the behest of society, certain players in the field who are financially motivated, and the government. And for all those reasons, you're asked to see a lot of people do a lot of things. And so people are not doing a good job of looking at medication usages, the consequences of those medications, the side effects of those medications. And often when you're proceeding towards polypharmacy, which is prescribing lots and lots of medications, you are finding that sometimes people are treating a side effect of a medicine with a new medicine instead of asking what was the side effect to begin with. So I focus on that mostly. Those probably are important discussions I have with patients.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Again, taking a more holistic view about what seems to be the problem rather than just prescribing something new every single time. And so I did want to ask you, again, given your location being in Kearney and again, given your specialty, it really seems that you have a much more intimate and a much more substantial relationship with the patients that you've encountered. I think that seems to be different than other physicians that we've met in the past, given that, again, you do have to talk to them about their diet and have a full understanding about their lifestyle to really make an impactful change on their symptoms. So I wanted to first ask you, again, for the amount of time that you've been in Kearney, how you've been able to be a big factor in the community, how you've been able to, again, make relationships with the people in Kearney, and how you describe the surrounding community. From my understanding, Kearney seems to be relatively about, 30,000 people when I do look it up, but from what we've spoke about, it's much more than that. There's a lot more people flooding in. So I was hoping you could tell listeners, again, what makes Kearney so special and how you've been able to have that type of special connection with the people that you do encounter.
Okay. So I've had this viewpoint back since the 1990s. I was in gastroenterology fellowship, but by the time I was chief resident, probably 1990, 91 onwards, I started to develop this bias. You use the term holistic, and that is the popular catchphrase, and maybe that is the best phrase, but it has different implications for different people. Some who are very scientifically bent in the Western medicine type approach tend to look down their noses at the idea of a holistic approach. They like to subdivide the body, dive deep into hormones and enzymes and the subcellular level, and talk about receptors and how medicines are going to impact this, that, or the other receptor. And so for in the eyes of some, a holistic term would sound a little too far-fetched or fanciful. Having said that, whether we use that term or not, that probably describes the way I do it. When I was a senior staff in a teaching capacity, I was already starting to practice this way. And then I spent 22 years in Oklahoma, where I had my own private practice. I was a solo, single practice private practitioner. Therefore, I could dictate what were the circumstances under how I practice. I was not beholden to others telling me exactly what to do in order to earn an income. There are positive and negative consequences of that. The less people you see, the less procedures you do, the less money you make. And so, then it's more of a burden on you to make sure you conserve your resources carefully, and you manage your resources better so that you're not wasteful. And I had a very good team with me as far as nurses and so on, and we had a good, thriving practice. The vagaries of modern medicine allowed for foreign entities, large international corporations, to come in, buy up local resources, buy up the local hospital, which then changed the atmosphere of the medicine that I could practice there. There was a lot of effort made to conform to their way of doing things, and they're typical for the modern multinational corporation. They'll tell you one thing, but they'll do another thing. And so they were in a manner or pushing for care in a manner that I did not care for. And so though it hurt me to make this decision after having settled down in the community, I realized that if I did not move, I would be forced to do things their way, which would then make it difficult for me to live with my conscience. So we moved, and we found in Kearney, Nebraska, a desire by the people who are managing the medical entities I'm working with, that they were also interested in a physician who had that, let's call it holistic point of view. They wanted a complete care, which is good to see. You don't see it very commonly. Again, many people will give lip service. It's common to use these buzzwords to attract interest, but when it comes right down to it, they'll proceed with another angle, because at the end of the day, they all have to justify their monetary income and their bottom line. These people were very open to the idea of what I was suggesting. I explained exactly how I practice in great detail. And to their credit, they have kept their word. And so I do not see tons of patients, but I stay busy. My general work day is about 11 hours a day, sometimes 12. And that includes some of the paperwork, unfortunately, or nowadays we'd call it digital computer work, but it's the same difference. You got to spend time generating it in order to be billing properly and making sure you conform to all the guidelines and so on. So there's a lot of things you got to do beyond just looking at people and talking to them. But a new patient visit with me is easily 40, 45 minutes, sometimes an hour, hour and a half. It just depends on how things go and what I'm trying to do. And so I genuinely am spending the kind of time that I claim I am, and try to talk to people about their problems, their issues. I have certain biases I bring to the table, but at the end of the day, I realize just because I may have a particular approach doesn't mean that's exactly what's going on with the patient. So in medicine, at least the way we were taught it, they encourage you not to have blinders on. So even though you may feel like you're headed in the proper direction, always be willing to step back and look at the bigger picture. We describe it as a differential diagnosis, so a broader perspective of what all could be going wrong. And one of the best times to be a little nervous is when you think things are going perfect and you got it all figured out. That's probably when you want to back off a little bit and say, I wonder, is it going as smooth as I think it is? And if it is, great, then you've nailed it. But if you haven't painted yourself into a corner.
Right.
I put in that kind of time and effort
To stay impartial there. Got you. And just for the listeners here who, again, might not be familiar with your background, the people that you now are working with is the Kearney Regional Medical Center, is that correct? With the Platte Valley Medical Clinic as well?
Correct. The physician I belong to is the Platte Valley Medical Clinic, and the hospital is called Kearney Regional Medical Center.
Got you.
And institutions, from my point of view, very people-oriented, and they have been very conducive to allowing care the way it should be delivered, in my opinion.
Gotcha. Could you speak a little bit more on that? And what do you mean on care in the way that it should be delivered compared to, again, the corporations that you encountered, whether it's in Oklahoma, how you've noticed that change by working with these people here in Kearney? The
traditional care of medicine, and one of the advantages or one of the biases that I have is my ancestral heritage. So I come from a culture and a heritage that has been focused on medicine for thousands of years. We have the oldest continuously existing system of medicine called Ayurveda. It's not readily acceptable in the West. And to be honest, I'm not an Ayurvedic practitioner, so I need to be cautious in stating that though I draw some inspiration from precepts and concepts within Ayurveda, which lead to this holistic approach. Ayurveda is very focused on prevention, okay? And they're also very focused on digestion as a manifestation of the rest of the body's illnesses. And so that gives me some inspiration, but at the end of the day, I'm not 100% well-versed in Ayurveda, and I would not claim to be practicing Ayurveda. I don't. But I use those precepts to guide me. And in nowadays, the magic words that people like to use is integrative or integrated medicine. And so that all makes everybody feel better that maybe it has some scientific basis to it. But at the end of the day, the biases are the same, which is look at what all's going on with the individual and look at how all these things connect and whether that manifests in a particular set of problems. Right. They had practitioners here prior to my coming who didn't see the world that way. They practiced a very different way. And when I was looking to move out of Oklahoma, it was a pleasant surprise to me to notice that even though I was an older physician looking, my initial concern was that because of age, my attraction or the desirability for people to hire me would be impacted, because you generally believe in the IT world, for example, the older you are, the quote, more washed up you are, unfortunately. And so they're looking for younger blood who they'll massage and egos for a couple of decades, and then they'll slowly move them out of the way as they find a newer, younger bunch. And so to some extent, that's a part of life. And so that was my concern. I was very surprised as I interviewed around the country. I don't care which part of the country I interviewed in, that nearly everybody was very, very interested in me, in my experience, and not a one mentioned age as an issue or anything like that. And so I explained to them that given my age and given my training and my experience and my biases, this is how I intend to practice. And if their goal was something else, I would not be happy there, and I wouldn't choose them. And again, to their credit, they kept their word. It is unusual in this country the world has gone a significant, at least America has, and I believe the world has, undergone a significant transformation in the last 50 years. We have lost our way in many, many ways. Of course, the younger generations, when they hear that, they raise their eyebrows because they think every older generation says the same thing about future generations and changing times, and there's some truth to that. There is some truth to that. But at the end of the day, there's no doubt in my mind that we have gotten away from personal, individualized caring about the human being, and we've tried to move in the direction of corporatizing everything. And corporatizing means you end up treating people like widgets. Now, it's rare to find an individual who will be brutally honest and say that's what he's doing or she's doing. Instead, right, they'll all use the appropriate corporate lingo, all sorts of words to make you feel better about, what they're eventually going to go to. And they'll couch it in those terms. And so they'll use things like people-centered and so on. But at the end of the day, as soon as you start working in most of these places, they're starting to drill down on, hey, how come it's taking you so long to see these people? Or, hey, they'll all tell you they like a proper dictation or a proper medical document that in the old days would be considered professional. Nowadays, through AI and through other mechanisms, they generate stuff that makes you wonder, did this guy even graduate from kindergarten? Because the verbiage chosen by the machine is not what you would normally use to communicate to patients or to the public, and especially not to referring doctors. Right. And so by a variety of mechanisms, everybody in this country now, in corporate America, but especially in medicine, I'm saddened to say, has become more of a widgetized on the treadmill process. The people I work with, they care about making money. Nobody wants to go broke. They have a very complex system, unfortunately, in America about how medications are reimbursed, how work effort is reimbursed. It's right, more complex than anything else anywhere in the world. They have adopted all kinds of mechanisms and borrowed from all over the world in ways that were never intended. For example, work value units and so on that they borrowed from the French and Europeans about how to code diseases so you can get a sense, at least that's how the French initially intended, how do you get a sense of who all is being seen for what? They suddenly monetized that and made it into a mechanism for reimbursement, which was never its intention. Right. And then in the typical American way, found a way to speed up the treadmill so you can go faster on it. And all of that in the name of corporate profit. Everybody's got to survive. Everybody's got to make money. I got all that. I'm happy to make money. Believe me, I'm very happy that I make the money I do. But my bias has always been that I'll do what I think is the right thing to do, even in private practice. I would say somewhere close to 15+% of my care was free. Not because I was a wonderful guy and just wanted to give away my care all day to everybody, but simply because you did what you had to do. You did the right thing. You took care of people who needed to be taken care of, and then let the chips fall to me. And as when you figured that all out in retrospect, you realize, gee, people, you came in, you got woken up in the middle of the night to go take care of someone who's bleeding to death, and you're doing a procedure that hopefully will save their lives, and it does. And then you realize that person has no insurance, no capacity to pay, and you'll make nothing out of it. And that's just how the cookie crumbles. That's how it is. You don't look at these individuals and go, well, first thing first, can you pay me? You don't do that, and you should never do that. Yeah. And I much in medical care in America, nobody does that per se. Nobody asks if you got the money, we'll do your heart cath, or we'll do this, or we'll do that. Nobody does that. There are laws to prevent it in the first place, but even otherwise, nobody really does. I've never met a single physician, even the ones who I didn't agree with about how they cared about people. I've never met one who only looked at, will they first pay and then everything else. Now, I'm sure they exist out there, especially for entities where cash on the barrel is the way they do things, outpatient services and certain kinds of entities. I'm sure they exist. But at least within the hospital environments, I've never met them. And certainly within my own personal experience, I've never met them. I'm not naive enough to think they don't exist, but it's nearly impossible to treat people that way, which is good.
I think it is a growing problem that many physicians have discussed, whether it's ICD-10 or whether it's RUs or things like that, insurance coming in the way. I think one big thing that they've mentioned in the past, again, just to put someone on a clinical trial, the amount of hoops that you'd have to jump through, again, for it to be, will this person be able to pay us back, or things like that. When at the end of the day, we're really just trying to deliver treatment as quick and efficiently as possible. There's definitely a lot of red tape and obstacles that have started to creep in providing quality care. But it is really nice to see that Kearney, the whole Valley Clinic there, is really on the physician side of being able to deliver good, high-quality care. But I wanted to ask, for you, what do you see the future of gastroenterology being about 5 years from now, given how practices are currently? Do you see more trouble on the horizon? Do you see any advancements that's been helping things? Or do you imagine it's going to be more issues like this as you continue on?
we have unnecessarily complicated the care of medicine.
Mm-hmm.
We've introduced many people into it that don't need to be there, and they, typical for America, have corporatized themselves into larger and larger entities, which then wield greater and greater power, which then translates to influence of lawmakers, which then transfers back as more income for them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is a bad trend for the whole country in nearly every line of work, in my opinion, but it's certainly true in medicine. So I think that's the days of what I was able to do, privately practice medicine as an individual or even in groups of physicians banding together. That is probably near extinction, sadly. I would be very surprised if 2 or 3 decades from now, those kinds of individuals will be able to survive. They don't tell you they're doing that. They want every physician to be an employed physician.
Right.
And then then they just mean that then translates to a controlled physician. And there is a huge amount of burnout in the medical fields, especially amongst physicians. Many are retiring early. Some of them took the COVID, you and I were talking about COVID impacts. It personally didn't impact me in any way because I was able to continue practicing because there was a need. In my line of work, people were needing cancer screenings and stuff, and you couldn't look them in the eye and say, oh, don't worry, if you just wait 3 years to get this done or that done, it won't matter to you. And it may not matter to the majority, but a few percentage will then have their cancer advanced to the point where they're not curable easily. And so cancer screening is a very big part. One of the things I really like about my line of work is that many, many physicians talk about prevention. My work, my field, gastroenterology, is heavily focused on prevention, preventive care, especially in terms of things like colon cancer screening. And so I think the future suggests that the ability for physicians to deliver the care the way they wish to and not become corporatized employees is against us. I think it'll become harder and harder to do so. And I don't think that's good. In my personal opinion, I don't think that's good. If you look at, there's actually a chart out there that I got. I shouldn't probably mention it if I can't reproduce it, but it looked at over the last 25 years, the rising costs and overhead. And while you looked at physician pay and ancillary personnel, nurses, physical therapists, respiratory therapists, et cetera, their costs to the system by means of their pay was rising gradually, 5%, 4%, 6%, somewhere in that range. But other overhead in institutions rose dramatically in the last 25 years, IT being one of them. Nobody understands how expensive IT is. And they constantly, there has become, in the medical field at least, a tendency for IT to become the big 3 or big 5 like it did for American automakers. And eventually it'll lead to the same sort of dysfunction as it has led to in the automotive industry. A core competency of capitalism is competition. Okay? Right. And take away competition, many of the attributes of capitalism go out the door. And so these companies are becoming larger and larger. Probably 90% of the IT market in medicine is monopolized by 3 groups. And they each claim they're better than, it's like the old story is, is Ford better than Chevrolet and is Chevrolet superior to Dodge, Chrysler. And in the end, no, they all are pretty bad in their own ways. They all have their own problems. And so you can decide which set of problems you want to buy into. And when you switch over, so we just went through a switch over from one IT product to another IT product for electronic medical services. And my gosh, the cost is mind blowing. I mean, I'm not free to discuss those things, but it's just amazing. That kind of money just 20 years ago would have started a hospital and paid for all the employees. Okay. And so, wow, so that's a huge part. Bureaucracy is another part. There is a rise in the management requirements for these entities. And like American corporations, there's a huge bloat of bureaucracy. Again, because Kearney Regional Medical Center is smaller and more physician-directed and more physician, we've been able to minimize a lot of that. But across the country, that's going to be an issue. We are, from the practice of medicine viewpoint, gastroenterology is a wonderful field. I think it'll continue a great role in people's lives. What new technologies are out there, time will tell. We've done some things, for example, in the last 20 years, I'm now taking off large growths that we would have been forced to send to a surgeon 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And 99% plus of the cases, the surgeon is not needed anymore for these kinds of growths. Now, there comes a point where the growth is big enough where it looks more like cancer that you shouldn't be dealing with it. It really needs surgical intervention. So it's not like the surgeon is not relevant. The surgeon is just as relevant as ever. But what we were doing before versus what we're doing now, being encouraged to do now, capable of doing the tools we have to allow us to do that, has enhanced the care for the patient in many ways. And so I think gastroenterology is a great field. I'm happy. It's certainly what I feel like it has been my calling in life. It was meant to be for me. And I'm happy I chose it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's great. I think, so just to kind of articulate a little bit more on what you mentioned here. So are there a lot more procedures being done in the clinic without having to refer them to a surgeon now? And is it just, again, more colonoscopies? You're able to have more maneuverability during those procedures? Well, again, for those little large ones that you're removing, those large biopsies, how is that advanced from before to now?
So first of all, I'm leery of anybody doing endoscopic procedures in their offices. So that clearly is a bias I have, okay? You need a professional environment, a surgery center or a hospital, a proper environment in which adequate nursing is provided, adequate surveillance equipment is provided for monitoring people, et cetera. So I want to make sure I'm clear on that. I'm not talking about procedures in a clinic per se. Now, the clinic may be attached to an endoscopy center or a hospital. That's a different thing. But just somebody choosing to do this in their office is not something I... Right. I just clarify that because it may not be clear to the public at large what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Having said that, the patients are sedated properly, monitored properly, and then we can do our procedures. What I think has helped us a lot are some techniques and some tools. Some of them are incredible in terms of the ability for the scopes to visualize things like narrowband imaging and other things that help you better delineate what you are looking at and make sure that you properly are evaluating the colon when you do a colonoscopy or anything else endoscopically. Right. But polypectomy, which is the removal of polyps, is how we end up helping people. You know, we don't receive a lot of fanfare. You know, when people see somebody who's been shot and dying and they've got a hole in their lung or whatever. There's a SWAT approach that, you know, the medical SWAT team comes in sort of and saves the day, and there's a lot of fanfare behind that, and everybody understands, oh my God, yes, you saved that person's life. But when you do something preventively, i.e. you take off a good-sized polyp, let's say 2.5, 3 centimeters in size, that maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now would have killed that person because it would have grown into a cancer and spread elsewhere. There is no sense out there, oh my God, look at that guy, he just saved that guy's life. But in general, you did. The primary care physician who refers such a patient is saving their lives by reminding them, hey, you're due for a colonoscopy. You qualify because of your family history, or you qualify because of your age, or hey, you qualify because of some of your symptoms. Go get this evaluated. Don't regret it. And thankfully, many times it's negative, which is great. That's what you want. You want to be able to give a clean bill of health and say, don't worry, you're good for now. But there's plenty of times afterwards. You do the procedure and you find, holy cow, had this been left alone, this would have been a major disaster. And so you actually save people's lives by removing this, sort of like a SWAT team, a medical SWAT team, but there's just not that credit given or that recognition given. But you make a huge impact in human lives.
No, of course. One thing that I do want to ask before we do wrap up here, and again, thank you so much. For physicians who are going to be entering, whether it's residency or going to start trying to establish a practice, or perhaps students who are now going to be entering medical school, given what you've noticed, given these trends that, again, we've spoken about today, what would be the advice that you'd hope to give them as they start their medical journey? Again, if you've noticed that clinics are slowly going to be dying out and that this autonomy has kind of been reduced as you go on in your field, what would you give as advice to the people who are now entering the field or perhaps growing to be a bigger part of it?
So I would actually quote my older son in one way. He says, he called me one time. He says, you know, everybody tells you seek your passion, seek what you really want to do. And, that's what you should do, is search for what really, really, motivates you or makes you want to do something. And, that's great advice, but he disagreed with that. And he said, I think that's wrong. And I said, why? And he said, well, a pygmy from Africa who wants to play against Michael Jordan in the NBA is going to be sorely disappointed. I don't care how great his passion is for basketball. Right. He's just not going to cut it.
Right.
Okay. And so he can dream all he wants. He can establish a pygmy league in Africa maybe, but he's not going to come to the NBA in the United States and make Michael Jordan lose sleep that he might lose to this guy. It's just not going to happen. All right. So more important than our passions, which I agree, we should try to do what we want to do, what we'd like to do. But more important than that is for these people who are going into medical school and so on to understand, are they good at something? Figure out what you're good at in life, and then figure out if you can monetize it, so if you can make a living at it. If you have some natural skills and talents and some proclivities, certain leanings that make you appreciate this, that, or the other, or certain interests. And so that's the first thing I would say is figure out what makes you tick, and then figure out if that's what you want to do for the rest of your life. And the more you're good at something, the more passionate you can be about it, is one way that my older son would have said. And I think I learned that from him just a few years ago, and I would agree with that approach, number one. Number two, I would make sure everybody understands that, there's a lot of people who, in fact, I would say nearly everybody who went into medicine went in very inspired and very idealistic about all the good they were going to do in the world. And then I go through the hard process of long hours, sleepless nights, competition amongst others to excel, because you have certain key aspects of medical care where the physicians seem to be making more money, and that's well known to everybody than other physicians. And so it suddenly becomes an issue of a gradation of opportunities and a gradation of wealth outcomes. And so if you're going to do this because, you hope to make a lot of money, well, great, then the competition is going to be pretty intense for where you're wanting to go, and be ready for that. And so it's not easy. You're often, sometimes people who go into medicine think they're the smartest people in the world. They're not. They're just good at what they're good at. There are smart engineers. There are smart everybody else doing anything else and everything else. There's smart IT people. We all have our skill sets we bring to this, but what they are definitely going to find out when they get into medical school is all of a sudden they're not the cock of the walk automatically. Everybody they're running across is a cock of the walk from wherever they came from. And so they all have something to offer, and the competition's intense. Ultimately, I would say make sure this is what you want to do. This is what you hope to commit your life to doing. I still believe, and I'm hoping it'll stay that way, that it is a calling. It is a different life, meaning you'll be woken up at night. I still am woken up at night for procedures. And it doesn't really matter whether I was woken up at night. The next day, I still have to go in and do the work I'm supposed to be doing. I may lose out on sleep, et cetera, et cetera. And when you're young and you bounce back easier, great. But you start getting into your 40s and so on, you start noticing, okay, you're not the same guy you were 20 years ago. You get into your 60s where I'm at, and you suddenly find out you're not the same guy you were in the 40s. And so these things catch up with you. In every field, there are some negatives, and certainly in the GI world, I have people I have trained and people who are my contemporaries who I'm noticing are having health problems, joint problems, body problems from the way they did their procedures and how they held their neck or their body or their hand, et cetera, et cetera. And so those ergonomic factors now play a part as you're getting older, as you're wearing out your body. There are people who lose feeling in their hands because their neck has been held in a particular way and they've got cervical disc issues. And so these all will impact you. I mean, it's just repetitive trauma. And at the end of the day, all we are is a fancy collection of fancy parts. And so those parts can be worn out. But I would encourage anybody who's going in with the right attitude that, hey, you may not become a billionaire overnight. In fact, I don't know of any physician out there, to be honest, who just as a physician can even become a millionaire easily anymore. Okay. And so the goal is, I'm just going to float on a cloud of money. Good luck. God bless. It's going to get tougher and tougher to do that as reimbursements keep down. So you have to believe yourself that this is a calling, that people need you, that you get joy from helping people. I've said forever to people who have gone into medicine, look, when your plumber comes and fixes your drain pipe that was leaking and you were woken up at night with the flooded floor or whatever, you thank him for it. He pays, he asks for a good chunk of money in return for the inconvenience. He'll come and take care of you. But then you don't see him on the street a week later, a month later, a year later, and go, hey, man, thank you so much for what you should let it go. You're done with it.
Right.
Physicians, when they make a difference in people's lives, and it's happened to me countless times, a year later, 5 years later, 10 years later, you'll see somebody, they'll look at you and go, you probably don't remember me. And if it's 10 years later, definitely I don't. And they'll tell you, well, you made a huge impact in my life. You did this, you did that. You changed my way of looking at the world. You spent time with me. You convinced me to eat differently. You helped me lose weight. Or you saved my life because you took off that huge polyp that somebody else couldn't. Whatever.
Right.
And there is a great deal of reward that comes from that. The joy of the satisfaction of people being genuinely grateful. And I think that part hopefully will continue. We have a lot of other metrics we need to work out in the way we're delivering care in this country. And we've got a lot of hurdles ahead.
Thank you. Again, that's the essence of what calls people to being a physician at the end of the day. Again, being able to make that direct impact is what I really envision it to be. But again, thank you so much for your time today, for the issues that you've brought up about where we're headed when it comes to the medical field. Again, that's a lot to really think about. But to leave it on a little bit of a brighter note, I've noticed that you're a little bit of a reader. You've mentioned before that you're a hiker or a biker. So I wanted to ask you, is there anything that you've read recently that you'd recommend to the public in the nonfiction that you've read that you think is, again, worthwhile, that you've really enjoyed?
I am mostly reading nonfiction, and a lot of my reading now in the last 5 to 10 years involves reconnecting with my cultural roots and heritage. And which may or may not appeal to the public at large, because not everybody comes from India, and not everybody knows what the Indian cultural experience and the diaspora experience is. I'm a very prolific, if that's the right word, reader. I've always read voraciously. My interests span a wide spectrum, and I would encourage anybody who is involved in getting into medicine, find some sideline reading or hobbies or anything else that balance your life more, family life, etc. Unfortunately, within medicine, family life often suffers, and it's rare to find a partnership that really works well, sadly. But I would say, if I were to encourage anybody to do any reading, I would say balance it between fiction and nonfiction. And mine used to be balanced. It has now become less balanced, sadly, so I'm reading much less fiction, much more nonfiction, looking at the true history of India, Bharat. What we now know, that we've been led down the wrong path in what we were told about our history and our ancestral heritage. And so much of the books I'm buying, in fact, nearly all the books I've bought in the last 3-4 years have all to do with that, which may or may not appeal to the public at large. But we are an ancient civilization. We're the oldest continuously existing civilization in the world, and we've contributed a lot of good to the world. And not much of that is known. And so that's where I spend my time reading now.
Perfect. Thank you so much again for any of those recommendations, and again for everything that you've told us today. Again, I'm Cherukuri with Radio Naira. This is Dr. Gopi Vasudevan. Thank you guys for listening to our show today, and I hope